In March 2012, Mass Effect 3 was released. It was met by fans with spirited criticism, particularly about the ending. Choices you made during the course of the trilogy were supposed to affect the finale, but the differences were minimal, at best. Later in 2012, Telltale's The Walking Dead came out, and players had a similar reaction. Players felt that Kenny Will Remember That didn't matter in the end, and any choices the players made didn't affect the outcome. Between these games, and with many games before and since, gamers have decried the so-called illusion of choice. The premise that, because your decisions didn't matter in the end, didn't affect the narrative in substantial ways, it's like you never made the choice in the first place. While I agree on some points, I also think this framing betrays a fundamental flaw in our worldview. Hi, I'm Michael, and this is Edited Memory. If there's one thing I know, it's that the developers of Mass Effect are to blame. For years, the players were told by the developers of Mass Effect that our choices would have a profound impact on the universe. When those choices failed to materialize in Mass Effect 2, we were told that the necessities of a 3-game arc required the second game to be more linear, and the third game would open fully. Right up until the game launch, the developers insisted that your choices would make substantial differences, with Casey Hudson, the game's director, famously saying, "It's not even in any way like the traditional game endings, where you can say how many endings there are or whether you got ending A, B, or C. The endings have a lot more sophistication and variety in them." This eventually proved to not be true. While there were many endings, none of them were particularly unique. Players were presented with a single choice between 3 options. All resulted in more or less the same outcome, varied slightly based on a galactic readiness score. For all the talk and all the posturing, none of the individual decisions affected the ending. If there's one thing I know, it's that the developers of The Walking Dead are to blame. They put it at the beginning of each episode. This game series adapts to the choices you make. The story is tailored to how you play. Every time a player made a choice, we were awarded with a message. Kenny will remember that. The first episode of this series was released a month after the launch of Mass Effect 3. We didn't get what we wanted from that game, but there it was. A new title claiming to be affected by player choice. They were clearly egging us on, and surely this one would live up to the claim. By the time the final episode of Season 1 was released, it was clear our choices made no difference. Sure, some of the details may have changed. Different characters made it to the end and stayed with us in the final moments. But at the end of the story, it was just Lee and Clementine. Lee lay dying after being bitten by a zombie, and Clementine had to put him out of his misery and wander off alone. Nothing we did as players changed that, in spite of the game telling us the story would be tailored to our play. If there's one thing I know, it's that gamers are to blame. Our expectations were simply too high for both these titles and more. We wanted Mass Effect 3 to be a completely unique experience for each player, with certain missions only available if you saved this character or made this decision in the past. And if those missions were cut out, it still had to be a coherent story that still made sense to each player. Each decision would double the workload for the team, and the game would take a lot longer than 2 years to make. The devs shouldn't have made the comments they made, but we allowed ourselves to be taken for fools. With The Walking Dead, we were projecting. The game gave us exactly what it told us it would. The story was always the same, but it tailored the story to our decisions, exactly as it promised us. Kenny did remember the decisions we made. It just didn't change where the story went. The only reason we latched onto this is because of the colossal failure of Mass Effect 3, and we wanted proof that it could be done, never stopping to reflect on why it wasn't. Did either game handle it perfectly? No, of course not. Ashley and Kaidan were basically interchangeable, regardless of which one you saved on Virmire. Carly or Doug still die at the beginning of Episode 3, regardless of which one you saved previously. Both games had multiple points of failure in storytelling, and in making the player feel like their choices mattered. But I personally can't stop feeling like the player takes as much blame in the overall disappointment as the developers. The quote I started this video off with comes from an unimportant mission in Mass Effect 1. Without going too deep into it, Garrus wants your help bringing someone to justice. If you convince Garrus to spare the bad guy's life, the bad guy attacks, and you're forced to kill him anyways. Garrus then asks what the point of sparing him was if he still ended up dead, to which Shepard responds,
"You can't predict how people will act, Garrus, but you can control how you'll respond. In the end, that's what really matters."
To me, this is one of the most important lines to the philosophy of game development. If we look at it from a gameplay perspective, it's a pretty simple interpretation. Game developers make a series of mechanics, then put them in front of players to see how they interact with them. Then, your job as a developer is to create a game that utilizes how players interact with those systems in order to make your game. If you apply it to a story perspective, we come across a philosophy that more story-based games should be taking. The player is always going to get from point A to point B. There's no medium that has ever really managed to change that in any meaningful capacity. The thrill of the interactive medium of games is the ability to alter that path between the 2 points. In short, the universe was always going to act in a particular way, but the players should be allowed to control how they'll respond. A character that is as much along for the ride as they are a central element. In the case of Mass Effect, Shepard was always on a path to save the galaxy. In Mass Effect 1, you have plenty of choices. You can talk to Bar Levon, who sends you off to Rex, or you can talk to Harkin, who tells you about Garrus. Both paths lead to Shepard saving Tali and finding information exposing Saren as a traitor. Whether you sacrifice Ashley or Kaidan, you blow up the Virmire base and eventually track down Saren. What matters is not the outcome of those situations, but how they affected the player's emotional state. This is why I don't particularly like the phrase illusion of choice. As a player, you made the choices, and they weighed heavy on you. In The Walking Dead, when I was forced to choose Carly or Doug, I felt guilty about making the choice, even as I knew I made the correct one. When I chose whether to set the Rachni Queen free or kill her in her cage, I struggled with whether I made the right choice or not. Perhaps it's better if I never know the answer, and have to leave it to future generations to worry about. This is the reason I prefer the term illusion of consequences. I made a choice, everyone did. The game and developers led us to believe there would be repercussions for those choices, and those were never realized. Mass Effect fooled me in 2 particular places that might surprise most people. The first was on Omega, during Mass Effect 2. I ran into my old buddy Garrus, who was taking on multiple armies single-handed. I joined up with him, but left him to defend the bridge by himself while me and my companions sealed the underground entry. When I came back, a gunship attacked him and left him nearly dead, permanently scarred. I thought to myself, if only I had left someone to defend him, he would still be okay. It turns out that no, this was always going to happen. It wasn't a consequence of my actions. The second happened during Mass Effect 3, when I confronted the Rachni Queen. I had chosen to save her in the first game, and now she was evil, and the Reapers were using her as a weapon against the galaxy. Had I made the wrong choice all those years before, when I had let her live? If I had killed her, she couldn't be used against me now. But whether you saved her or not, this mission still happened. The difference was a few lines of dialogue and a positive versus a negative number in a ledger. No substantial consequences to be found. Add in how Ashley and Kaidan were completely interchangeable, particularly in Mass Effect 2, and when I got to the ending, I wasn't able to be fooled again. The illusion of consequences had been broken. I knew my choices would have no consequences. So while everyone was raging about how the ending didn't take their choices into account, I was able to view the entire debacle from an outsider's perspective. The lessons of Mass Effect 3 and The Walking Dead aren't that developers should take more care to include consequences for player choice. It's that they shouldn't pretend that there will be. Such a system is nearly impossible to include on a large scale, particularly one spanning multiple games. We as gamers should be more cautious about what developers are telling us, since their job is to hype us up and get us to buy the game, not answer for its failure to live up to those expectations. Time and time again in my life, I've watched as developers promise the moon and then fail to deliver. I've watched Peter Molyneux promise that you can plant a tree and see it grow in the Fable series. I watched Casey Hudson promise that Mass Effect wouldn't have an A, B, or C ending, and I watched Sean Murray promise that No Man's Sky would have thriving planets with entire ecosystems, wrecked ships to explore, and giant space battles. While I may enjoy these games, and even respect the developers I've mentioned, I have to acknowledge that they failed to live up to their promises. And at a certain point, I have to admit my own culpability in the matter. I've been lied to so many times. I should really know better. Maybe we should all take a step back from the hype machine and wait for reactions before we buy into a game. But sadly, I think that's a little optimistic. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Sorry it took a little longer to get this one out, but I've been dealing with some personal issues. But I did want to get this out before the Legendary Edition is released, so hopefully it doesn't feel rushed. As much as I can be a critic of the sequels, I am genuinely excited for the re-release, and I wanted to make this video as my own way of celebrating. Mass Effect 1 remains one of my favorite games of all time, so if you haven't had a chance to play it, or even if it's been a while, I do hope you use this as an excuse to try it out for yourself. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael, and this was Edited Memory.